The whispers started before Madeline Rhodes even set foot inside the white clapboard church, that Sunday morning in 1876. She felt the stairs like needles against her skin as she made her way up the dusty main street of Verdi, Nevada, her belly swollen with child despite the absence of any ring on her finger. The spring sun beat down mercilessly on the small mining town nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Madeline clutched her worn Bible tighter to her chest, her knuckles white with tension. 6 months ago, she'd arrived in Verdi to take a position as the schoolteacher, young and full of ideals. Now, at 22, she carried a secret that was becoming impossible to hide. "Morning, Miss Rhodes," called Mr. Finley from the general store's porch, his tone deliberately formal, eyes fixed pointedly on her protruding middle. Madeline nodded politely but kept walking. There was no use in pretending anymore. She'd managed to conceal her condition with loose dresses and shawls for months, but nature had its way of revealing truths. The school board would dismiss her soon enough. She knew that much. But she wouldn't miss church, not when faith was all she had left. The church bell tolled its final call as Madeline reached the steps. She paused, gathering courage, feeling the child within her stir as if in encouragement. Inside, she could hear Reverend Phillips leading the congregation in the opening hymn. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy wooden door. The singing faltered as heads turned. Madeline kept her eyes forward, sliding into the last pew, trying to make herself as small as possible, an impossible task. The music resumed, but the damage was done. The whispers flitted between the notes like darting sparrows, disgraceful. "And she teaches our children." Always thought she carried herself too proudly. Madeline fixed her gaze on the simple wooden cross above the altar. She wouldn't cry, not here, not now. She'd done enough crying in the privacy of her small rented room. Zeb Yates sat halfway up the church, his tall frame hunched slightly to fit comfortably in the pew. At 30, he was considered a confirmed bachelor in Verdi, though not for lack of interested parties. The women of Verdi found his quiet demeanor and success as a cattle rancher appealing, but Zeb had always been more comfortable with horses than people. He'd noticed Miss Rhodes the first Sunday she'd appeared in town last fall. It was hard not to. Her chestnut hair and bright, intelligent eyes stood out among the weathered faces of the mining town. She'd arrived to teach at the newly built schoolhouse, and from what Zeb had heard at the saloon, the children adored her. Today, though, something was different. The change in atmosphere was palpable as she entered. Zeb turned slightly, catching sight of her condition for the first time. Unlike the others, his expression registered concern rather than judgment. Reverend Phillips finished the hymn and cleared his throat. "Brothers and sisters, let us pray." The congregation bowed their heads, but the Reverend didn't immediately begin. Zeb glanced up, noticing the pastor's gaze fixed firmly on the back pew. "Before we continue our worship," Reverend Phillips said, his voice sharper than usual, "I feel compelled to address a matter of moral concern." Madeline's heart sank. She knew what was coming. "Our community has always prided itself on upholding Christian values," the Reverend continued. "We have welcomed strangers and shown charity to those in need. But there are standards of conduct that must be maintained, particularly by those entrusted with the education of our children." The congregation stirred, several heads turning to stare openly at Madeline now. "Miss Rhodes," Reverend Phillips called, pointing a finger toward her. "You present yourself in God's house in a condition that speaks of sin and moral failing. How do you justify your presence here, flaunting your shame before the very families whose children you instruct?" The church fell silent. Madeline felt the blood drain from her face as every eye turned to her. She tried to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. "I have not forsaken my faith, Reverend," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite her racing heart. "I come to worship as I have always done." Mrs. Whittaker, president of the Ladies' Aid Society, rose to her feet. "It's inappropriate. A woman in her situation, teaching impressionable young minds. The school board should have dismissed her weeks ago." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation. Madeline felt the room spinning around her, shame and indignation warring within her chest. "I believe," continued the Reverend, "that it would be best if you sought worship elsewhere until you have properly atoned for your indiscretion. This is a house of God, not a haven for that's enough." The deep voice cut through the tension like a knife, heads swiveled toward its source. Zeb Yates had risen to his feet, his tall frame commanding attention, his expression thunderous beneath his usually calm exterior. "Mr. Yates." The Reverend seemed surprised by the interruption from one of the town's most respected citizens. "If Miss Rhodes is to be shamed for her condition," Zeb said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, "then shame me too." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Madeline stared at the rancher, confusion etched across her face. She barely knew the man had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with him in passing since her arrival in Verdi. "What are you saying, Mr. Yates?" demanded Reverend Phillips. Zeb's jaw tightened. He looked directly at Madeline as he spoke his next words. "I'm saying that no one stands alone in this church today. If Miss Rhodes is unwelcome, then I'll leave too." He stepped into the aisle and walked deliberately toward the back pew. The congregation watched in stunned silence as he reached Madeline, offered his arm, and said quietly, "May I accompany you outside, Miss Rhodes?" Bewildered but grateful for the unexpected alliance, Madeline nodded and took his arm. Together they walked down the aisle and out the church door, leaving a wake of astonished faces behind them. Outside in the bright Nevada sunshine, Madeline finally found her voice. "Mr. Yates, I appreciate your gesture, but why would you do that? You don't even know me." Zeb removed his hat and ran a hand through his sandy hair. "I know enough, Miss Rhodes. I know you've brought learning to children who'd otherwise have none. I know you've stayed late helping the Simpson boy with his reading when others gave up on him." He paused, looking down at her with eyes the color of a summer sky. "And I know what it means to be judged unfairly. No one deserves what happened in there." Tears welled in Madeline's eyes despite her determination to remain composed. "You've risked your reputation for a stranger." Zeb shrugged, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Reputations can be rebuilt. Kindness shouldn't be rationed." A commotion at the church door interrupted them as several parishioners spilled out, Mrs. Whittaker at the forefront. "Well, I never," she exclaimed. "Zeb Yates, are you claiming responsibility for her condition?" Before Madeline could protest, Zeb stepped slightly in front of her, shielding her from the growing crowd. "I'm claiming responsibility for standing against injustice, Mrs. Whittaker. Something this town seems to have forgotten how to do." Reverend Phillips pushed through the onlookers, his face flushed with indignation. "Mr. Yates, your behavior is most irregular. If you're implying what I think you are, I'm not implying anything, Reverend," Zeb interrupted firmly. "I'm simply saying that if this church can't find room for a good woman in difficult circumstances, then perhaps it's forgotten the message of its founder." Madeline touched his arm. "Mr. Yates, please don't feel obligated to defend me. I knew what I was facing when I decided to come today." Zeb looked down at her, admiration flickering in his eyes. "You're braver than most men I know, Miss Rhodes." The Reverend cleared his throat. "Miss Rhodes, the school board will be meeting tomorrow to discuss your situation. I suggest you prepare accordingly." Madeline straightened her spine. "I'll be there, Reverend. But I won't apologize for carrying this child. Every life is sacred. Isn't that what you preach? A few uncomfortable glances were exchanged in the crowd. Mr. Collins, who owned the lumber mill and had 3 children in Madeline's class, spoke up. My Emma says you're the best teacher this town's ever had, Miss Rhodes. Seems a shame to lose you over. Well, over upholding moral standards, Mrs. Whittaker interjected. Think of the example she's setting. I'm thinking of the 30 children who might lose their education, Zeb countered. This town fought for 3 years to get a proper school. Are we really going to dismiss the only qualified teacher because of personal matters that have nothing to do with her abilities? The debate might have continued, but Madeline suddenly swayed, her face paling. Zeb caught her elbow, steadying her. Miss Rhodes needs rest, he announced firmly. This discussion can wait for the board meeting. Without waiting for further argument, he guided Madeline away from the church, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed them. Where do you live? He asked quietly. Mrs. Perkins' boarding house, Madeline replied, grateful for his supportive arm. But please, Mr. Yates, you've done enough. I can manage from here. Zeb shook his head. I'll see you safely home. The sun's fierce today and you've had quite a morning. As they walked slowly down Verdi's main street, Madeline felt the weight of the town's judgment following them. Yet somehow, with this stranger's unexpected kindness, the burden seemed slightly lighter. You know they'll talk, she said softly. About you now, too. Zeb's mouth quirked in a half-smile. Let them. Gives them something to do besides complaining about the railroad rates. Despite everything, Madeline found herself smiling. You're an unusual man, Mr. Yates. Zeb, he corrected. And I'm just a rancher who believes in fairness, Miss Rhodes. Nothing unusual about that. Madeline, she offered in return. When they reached the boarding house, Madeline hesitated on the porch steps. Thank you, Zeb, truly. But I need to understand why risk your standing in the community for me. Zeb considered her question, his expression thoughtful. My father taught me that a man's character is revealed in how he treats those who can offer him nothing in return. He glanced at her middle. That child you're carrying is innocent, and so are you, far as I'm concerned. The rest is between you and God. Madeline blinked back tears. Most don't see it that way. Most aren't looking beyond their own comfort, Zeb replied. Will you be all right? For tonight, I mean. Madeline nodded. Mrs. Perkins has been kind despite everything. She allows me to stay though others have pressured her to turn me out. Zeb nodded approvingly. Good woman. I'll be at that board meeting tomorrow, Madeline. You won't face them alone. With that promise, he tipped his hat and turned to leave, his tall figure striding purposefully down the dusty street. Madeline watched him go, wondering what twist of fate had brought this unlikely ally into her life on the very day she needed one most. Inside her small room, Madeline sank onto her narrow bed, one hand resting on her swollen abdomen. The baby kicked, as if sensing her turmoil. Well, little one, she whispered, it seems we might have found a friend after all. The board meeting was set for 2 o'clock the following day at the schoolhouse. Madeline arrived early, organizing her desk and classroom as she had each morning for the past 6 months. If this was to be her last day here, she would leave everything in perfect order. She heard boots on the wooden steps and turned, expecting to find the first board members arriving. Instead, Zeb Yates stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking oddly formal in a clean shirt and vest. You came, Madeline said, unable to hide her surprise. Said I would, didn't I? Zeb replied, stepping into the classroom and glancing around with interest. Never spent much time in schoolrooms. Left formal education behind when my mother died. I was 12. I'm sorry, Madeline said softly. Zeb shrugged. Long time ago now. My father did his best, taught me to read and figure. The rest I learned from living. He nodded toward the neat rows of desks. You've done well here. Children talk about your lessons even at the general store." Before Madeline could respond, voices sounded outside. The board members were arriving: Mr. Collins from the lumber mill, Dr. Adams, Mrs. Whittaker, Reverend Phillips, and Mayor Johnson. 5 people who would decide her future in Verdi. "Remember," Zeb said quietly as they entered, "whatever happens here today, you have nothing to be ashamed of." The meeting proceeded much as Madeline had expected. Reverend Phillips spoke at length about moral standards and the teacher's position as a role model. Mrs. Whittaker enumerated the complaints she'd received from concerned mothers. The men shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between the town's need for a teacher and the scandal of her condition. When they finally invited Madeline to speak in her own defense, she rose with as much dignity as she could muster. "I understand your concerns," she began, her voice steady. "I came to Verdi with excellent references and a genuine desire to educate your children. That hasn't changed. My private circumstances have no bearing on my abilities as a teacher." "But surely you must see," Mrs. Whittaker interrupted, "the moral contradiction of an unwed mother teaching impressionable young minds about virtue and proper behavior." Madeline took a deep breath. "I teach reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and science, Mrs. Whittaker. I leave moral instruction to parents and the church. But if you're concerned about the example I set, I would suggest that how this town treats a woman in difficulty might teach the children more about Christian values than any sermon." Mayor Johnson cleared his throat. "Miss Rhodes, no one questions your teaching abilities, but this is a small community. People talk. Parents are uncomfortable." "If I may," Zeb interjected from where he stood at the back of the room. All heads turned toward him in surprise. "Mr. Yates," said the mayor with evident confusion, "you don't have children in the school. What interest do you have in these proceedings?" Zeb stepped forward. "I pay taxes that support this school, same as anyone, and I have an interest in living in a community that treats people fairly." He looked directly at each board member in turn. "You all know me. I've lived in Verdi my whole life. My ranch employs 6 men year-round. I've never caused trouble or given anyone reason to doubt my word." The board members nodded cautiously, clearly uncertain where he was heading. "Then I ask you to believe me when I say that Miss Rhodes deserves better than this judgment. Before you vote, consider what message you're sending to everyone in Verdi: that mistakes can't be forgiven, that there's no place for compassion in your Christianity, that a woman alone must be punished while men face no consequences for the same actions." A heavy silence fell over the room. Madeline stared at Zeb, moved by his impassioned defense but increasingly puzzled by his personal investment in her situation. Dr. Adams, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Forgive me for asking, Miss Rhodes, but in the interest of clarity, is there a father in the picture? Someone who might make this situation more conventional?" All eyes turned to Madeline. She hesitated, then lifted her chin. "No, Dr. Adams, there is not." Mrs. Whittaker made a small sound of disapproval. "There is," Zeb's voice rang out clearly, causing everyone to turn back to him in shock. "I'm the father." Madeline's mouth fell open in astonishment. The board members exchanged stunned glances. "Mr. Yates," Reverend Phillips began uncertainly, "are you saying—" "I'm saying that I'm responsible for Miss Rhodes' condition," Zeb continued steadily, not looking at Madeline. "And I'm prepared to make it right." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Mayor Johnson banged his hand on the desk for order. "Mr. Yates, this is a serious claim. Are you formally acknowledging paternity of Miss Rhodes' child?" "I am," Zeb affirmed, his expression resolute. "Then why has this not been addressed before now?" demanded Mrs. Whittaker. "Why the secrecy? Why hasn't Miss Rhodes simply said so? Before Zeb could respond, Madeline found her voice. Because it isn't true. All eyes swiveled back to her. Mr. Yates is being gallant, she continued, her voice trembling slightly, but we barely know each other. He's not the father of my child. Zeb stepped toward her. Madeline, no, she interrupted firmly. I won't let you sacrifice your reputation for me. It's not your responsibility. An uncomfortable silence descended on the room. Mayor Johnson cleared his throat. Well, this is unexpected. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in private. There's nothing to discuss, Madeline said, gathering her courage. The truth is simple. I made a mistake before coming to Verdi. I trusted someone I shouldn't have. When I discovered my condition, he wanted nothing to do with me or the child. I came here to start fresh, to make an honest living doing work I love. She looked around at the board members. I understand if you feel you must dismiss me. But please know that I've given everything I have to teaching these children, and I would continue to do so if allowed. Dr. Adams studied her thoughtfully. And if we were to retain you, Miss Rhodes, what of the child? Motherhood is demanding work, as is teaching. I've made arrangements with Mrs. Perkins, Madeline replied. She's agreed to help care for the baby during school hours for a fee, of course. Mr. Collins rubbed his chin. My Emma would be heartbroken to lose you as her teacher. She's finally taking an interest in her studies. The Simpson boy's reading now, added Mayor Johnson. His father nearly wept telling me about it last week. Mrs. Whittaker stiffened. Surely we're not considering keeping her on. The scandal would be intolerable, perhaps, said Dr. Adams slowly. There's a compromise to be found. The board withdrew to deliberate, leaving Madeline and Zeb alone in the classroom. The moment the door closed behind them, Madeline rounded on him. Why would you say such a thing? She demanded, her voice low but intense. Why would you claim to be? Because it would have solved your problem, Zeb answered simply. By creating a lie. By tying yourself to a woman you barely know and a child that isn't yours. Zeb's expression remained calm. I could have made it right, Madeline, still could. A marriage certificate would silence the gossips. Madeline stared at him in disbelief. You would marry a stranger, take responsibility for another man's child. Why? Something flickered in Zeb's eyes, something that made Madeline's heart beat faster. Maybe you're not as much a stranger as you think. I've watched you since you came to town. Seen how you stopped to help old Mrs. Harmon carry her groceries. How you give extra time to the children who struggle most. How you stand straight and proud despite the whispers. He took a step closer. I admire you, Madeline Rhodes, and I believe a woman with your courage would make a fine mother to any child, and a fine wife to any man fortunate enough to win her trust. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. You can't possibly mean that. I don't say things I don't mean, Zeb replied, his voice gentle but firm. Think about it. My offer stands. Before Madeline could formulate a response, the door opened and the board members filed back in. Their expressions gave nothing away as they took their seats. Mayor Johnson cleared his throat. Miss Rhodes, we've reached a decision. In light of your excellent teaching record and the unusual circumstances, we are prepared to allow you to complete the school term, which ends in 6 weeks. By then, your condition will make continued teaching impractical regardless. Relief flooded through Madeline. 6 weeks meant 6 more weeks of salary, 6 more weeks to figure out what came next. However, the mayor continued, we must insist on propriety. If you wish to return to teaching after your confinement, you would need to have resolved your situation in a manner the community would find acceptable. Madeline understood the implication. Without a husband, she would not be welcomed back. Thank you for the opportunity to finish the term, she said quietly. I appreciate your consideration. As the meeting adjourned, Madeline gathered her things, emotions churning within her. 6 weeks. It wasn't much, but it was something. Zeb waited for her outside the schoolhouse. 6 weeks, he said as she emerged. Better than nothing. How did you know, small town? News travels fast. He fell into step beside her as she headed back toward the boarding house. Have you thought about what comes after? Madeline sighed. Constantly, I have some savings. Perhaps I can find a position in a larger city where people are less concerned with personal matters. Or you could stay in Verdi, Zeb suggested quietly. Madeline gave him a sidelong glance. You can't still be thinking of your proposal. It was a generous impulse, Mr. Yates, but Zeb, he corrected. And it wasn't an impulse. I've been watching you for months, Madeline. I'm not a man who acts without thinking. They had reached the boarding house. Madeline turned to face him on the porch steps, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. You don't know me, she said softly. I'd like to, he replied. Give me the chance. Let me call on you properly. We have 6 weeks before you need to make any decisions. Madeline studied his face, the clear blue eyes, the lines that spoke of outdoor work and laughter, the steadiness in his gaze. There was something about him that inspired trust, despite the recklessness of what he proposed. Very well, she said finally. You may call on me. But I make no promises, Zeb Yates. A smile spread across his face, transforming his features. Fair enough. I'll come tomorrow evening if that suits, Madeline nodded, a strange flutter of anticipation mingling with her trepidation. Tomorrow evening. As Zeb walked away, Madeline wondered what she was getting herself into. The man was practically a stranger, yet he defended her publicly, offered to claim her child as his own, and now wanted to court her properly. It made no sense unless he was touched in the head or had the most generous heart she'd ever encountered. Either way, she had 6 weeks to discover the truth. True to his word, Zeb arrived at the boarding house the following evening. Mrs. Perkins showed him into the small parlor with barely concealed curiosity. The older woman had been kind to Madeline throughout her predicament, but even she couldn't resist the intrigue of the town's most eligible bachelor calling on her, unwed pregnant boarder. Zeb stood as Madeline entered, a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. Good evening, Miss Rhodes. Mr. Yates, she replied, accepting the flowers with a smile. Thank you. These are lovely. Found them growing by the creek, he said, watching as she arranged them in a small glass vase Mrs. Perkins hastily provided. Nothing fancy, but they caught my eye. They sat in the parlor under Mrs. Perkins' discreet but obvious supervision, making somewhat awkward small talk about the weather and local happenings. After 20 minutes of this, Zeb suggested a short walk as the evening was fine. Just around the block, he assured Mrs. Perkins. I'll have her back before dark. Outside in the golden evening light, both seemed to relax. Madeline breathed deeply, enjoying the scent of sage on the breeze. Thank you, she said after they'd walked a little way. I was beginning to feel like a specimen under glass in there. Zeb chuckled. Mrs. Perkins means well. She's protecting you. And watching the most interesting thing to happen in Verdi since the bank robbery 3 years ago, Madeline added wryly. Was there really a bank robbery? So I'm told. Apparently, the robbers were so disappointed by the meager takings they left $5 for the teller's lunch. They both laughed, and something in the air between them eased. Zeb offered his arm and Madeline took it, finding comfort in his solid presence. Tell me about your ranch, she prompted as they strolled past the darkened storefronts. Zeb's face lit up. Twin Pines. It's not the biggest spread in the county, but it's good land. My father started with just 40 acres and built it up to nearly 500 before he passed. I've added another 100 since then. You must be proud of what you've accomplished. It's good work, Zeb said simply. Honest work, the kind that lets you sleep at night knowing you've done something worthwhile. Like teaching, Madeline observed. Exactly like teaching. Creating something that lasts. He glanced at her. Speaking of which, how are the children taking the news? Madeline sighed. Some parents have kept their children home. Others pretend nothing has changed. The children themselves are mostly curious, though they've been warned not to ask questions. But they do anyway, of course. Children always find a way to ask what adults won't. She smiled ruefully. Little Sarah Miller asked if I'd swallowed a watermelon seed. Zeb laughed. And what did you tell her? That babies grow from love, not seeds, and sometimes love doesn't work out the way we expect, but the babies are precious anyway. Zeb's expression softened. That was well said. They walked in companionable silence for a few moments. As they turned the corner back toward the boarding house, Zeb spoke again. Madeline, I know this is forward of me, but I'd like to know the father of your child. Is he dead? No. Madeline's voice hardened slightly. Very much alive, last I heard, and very much uninterested in acknowledging his responsibilities. I'm sorry. Don't be. I made my choice with open eyes. I just didn't expect. She trailed off, one hand resting on her swollen abdomen. To face the consequences alone, Zeb finished quietly. Madeline nodded. It was foolish of me. I believed in love and promises. Classic schoolgirl naivety. There's nothing naive about believing in love, Zeb countered. Just in thinking all men understand what love means. Madeline looked up at him, struck by the insight in his words. You sound like you speak from experience. A shadow crossed Zeb's face. Let's just say I've seen what happens when people confuse desire with love. It never ends well. They had reached the boarding house. Madeline turned to face him on the porch steps. Thank you for the walk, Mr. Yates. It was refreshing. Zeb, he reminded her with a small smile, and thank you for your company. May I call on you again? Despite her better judgment, Madeline found herself nodding. You may. Over the next weeks, Zeb became a regular visitor at the boarding house. 3 evenings a week, he would arrive promptly at 7, sometimes with small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, fresh honey from a neighbor's hives, a carved wooden duck he'd made himself during the long winter evenings. They took walks when weather permitted, sat in the parlor when it didn't, and gradually, the initial awkwardness between them dissolved into genuine friendship. Madeline learned about Zeb's childhood on the ranch, his dreams of expanding his herd, his quiet passion for the land. In turn, she told him about growing up in Boston, her father's position as a professor, her decision to seek independence in the West after her parents' deaths left her alone in the world. What she didn't tell him was the complete truth about her child's father, that he had been a married man, a visiting lecturer at her father's university, who had pursued her relentlessly, and then abandoned her when she told him of the pregnancy. That shame she kept buried deep, alongside the heartbreak of her own foolishness. As her time at the school drew to a close, Madeline found herself dreading the final day more than she had anticipated. Not just because of the loss of income and purpose, but because it would mean a decision had to be made about her future and about Zeb's increasingly clear intentions. 2 days before the end of term, Zeb invited her to see his ranch. Mrs. Perkins can chaperone, he assured her. I'll bring the buggy around on Saturday morning if you're agreeable. Madeline hesitated. Going to Zeb's home felt like crossing a line, acknowledging the seriousness of whatever was growing between them. Yet she was curious about the place he spoke of with such pride. Very well, she agreed. Saturday it is. Saturday dawned clear and warm, a perfect late spring day. Zeb arrived with his buggy, a well-maintained vehicle with fresh cushions clearly added for Madeline's comfort. Mrs. Perkins settled herself in the back seat, parasol at the ready, while Zeb helped Madeline up to the front, his hands strong and steady around her waist. Twin Pines Ranch lay 5 miles outside town, a pleasant drive through rolling sagebrush country that gradually gave way to greener pastures as they approached the property. Madeline could see why the ranch had its name. 2 massive ponderosa pines stood sentinel at the entrance to a well-kept compound consisting of a main house, barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. "It's beautiful," Madeline said honestly as they pulled up before the house. Zeb's face showed pleasure at her approval. "Been in my family since '48. My father built the original cabin himself." He nodded toward a smaller structure behind the main house. "That's it there. I keep it maintained, though we moved into the bigger house when I was about 10. The main house was modest but solidly built, with a wide porch wrapping around 2 sides. A few ranch hands tipped their hats as Zeb helped Madeline and Mrs. Perkins down from the buggy. "Mr. Yates runs a tight ship," one of the men told Madeline as he took the reins. "Best outfit in the county to work for." Inside, the house was surprisingly comfortable. Simple, functional furniture was arranged to take advantage of the natural light from generous windows. Bookshelves lined one wall of the main room, more books than Madeline would have expected. "My mother's collection," Zeb explained, noting her interest. "She taught my father to read when they married. He made sure I appreciated what education we could manage." Mrs. Perkins excused herself to inspect the kitchen, her curiosity about the bachelor's housekeeping evident. Left momentarily alone, Madeline moved to the window that overlooked pastures stretching toward distant mountains. "You have a good life here," she observed quietly. Zeb came to stand beside her. "It's a good place to raise a family," he said, his voice equally soft. Madeline turned to look at him, finding his gaze already on her face, intent and serious. "Zeb, hear me out, Madeline, please." He took a deep breath. "These past weeks, getting to know you, have been the best of my life. You're intelligent, kind, stronger than anyone I know. I admire you more than I can say." He took her hands in his, and Madeline let him, her heart pounding. "I know this isn't conventional. I know there are 100 reasons why you might say no, but I'm asking anyway." He paused, visibly gathering his courage. "Madeline Rhodes, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had half expected it, the proposal still left Madeline breathless. "Zeb, you don't have to do this. I've never asked you to take responsibility for me or my child." "I know that," he said earnestly. "This isn't about responsibility. It's about wanting to build a life with you, about admiring the woman you are and wanting to be the man who stands beside you." He squeezed her hands gently. "I'm not asking out of pity or some misplaced sense of chivalry. I'm asking because I've fallen in love with you, Madeline, and I believe we could be happy together." Tears sprang to Madeline's eyes. "How can you know that? We've known each other such a short time and under such unusual circumstances." "Some things you just know," Zeb said simply. "I knew the moment I saw you in that church, holding your head high despite everything, that you were someone special. Everything since has only confirmed it." Madeline's mind raced. Could she trust this feeling between them? Could she trust him, after being so terribly wrong before? "The baby would have your name," Zeb continued softly. "Would be raised as my own. No one would ever need to know differently. And you would be content with that, claiming another man's child." Zeb's gaze was steady. "Any man can father a child, Madeline. It takes more to be a father. I'd be proud to be that for your baby." Madeline felt something shift inside her, a wall beginning to crumble. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," Zeb urged. "That's all I ask for now." Before she could respond, Mrs. Perkins returned, full of praise for the orderly kitchen and pantry. The moment passed, but Zeb's words lingered in Madeline's thoughts throughout the tour of the ranch and the drive back to town. That night, alone in her room, Madeline placed her hands on her rounded abdomen, feeling the baby move within her. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Is he sincere? Could we make a life here?" The baby kicked vigorously, as if in response. Madeline smiled despite her confusion. "You're right. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The final day of school arrived with an unexpected celebration. The children had prepared a small party with help from some of the parents who had gradually softened their stance toward Madeline. There were cookies and lemonade, handmade cards, and even a few tearful hugs. "Will you come back after your baby is born, Miss Rhodes?" asked Emma Collins, her freckled face serious. Madeline hesitated. "I'm not sure yet, Emma, but I'll always remember each of you." As the children filed out for the last time, Madeline felt a curious mixture of sadness and relief. She'd survived these difficult months, maintained her dignity, and even won back some of the community's respect. Whatever came next, she could face it. She was gathering her personal belongings when a shadow fell across the classroom door. Looking up, she expected to see Zeb he'd promised to walk her home, but instead found a smartly dressed stranger standing in the doorway. "Miss Rhodes." The man removed his hat, revealing dark hair going silver at the temples. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Madeline straightened, instinctively placing one hand protectively over her belly. "School is dismissed for the summer. If you're looking for the board members, I'm looking for you, actually." He stepped into the room, extending his hand. "Harold Pemberton. We've met before, though it's been some time." Madeline's blood ran cold as recognition dawned. Harold Pemberton, her child's father, stood before her, smiling as if they were old acquaintances meeting by chance. "What are you doing here?" she managed to ask, ignoring his outstretched hand. Pemberton's smile faltered slightly. "I've been searching for you for months, my dear, when you disappeared from Boston. Well, I was concerned." "Concerned," Madeline repeated flatly. "How touching. Especially given your reaction when I informed you of my condition." Pemberton glanced around the empty classroom, lowering his voice. "I was shocked, Madeline. Unprepared. I said things I didn't mean." "You told me to take care of it and never contact you again," Madeline reminded him coldly. "You made it quite clear where your priorities lay." "I was wrong," he said, stepping closer. "I've had time to think, to regret my hasty words. That's why I've come to make amends." Madeline regarded him skeptically. "Amends? What does that mean exactly?" Pemberton smiled again, all charm and confidence. "I want to take care of you, of course. Set you up somewhere comfortable, San Francisco, perhaps. Provide for you and the child." "As your mistress," Madeline clarified, her voice steady despite the anger rising within her. He had the grace to look slightly abashed. "My situation hasn't changed, Madeline. I'm still married. But that doesn't mean I can't ensure you both live comfortably." "And what of your wife? Does she know you're here, offering to establish your pregnant former student in a love nest?" Pemberton's expression hardened. "Let's not be crude, my dear. I'm trying to do the honorable thing." A laugh escaped Madeline before she could stop it. "Honorable? There's nothing honorable about what you're proposing, Harold. There never was." "You didn't object to our arrangement in Boston," he reminded her, an edge entering his voice. "Because I believed you loved me," Madeline replied quietly. "Because I was young and foolish enough to think your promises meant something." Pemberton's face flushed with irritation. "Don't be difficult, Madeline. You're in no position to refuse my generosity. Look at you, an unwed mother-to-be, dismissed from your teaching position in a backwater town. What options do you possibly have? Better ones than you might think." The deep voice from the doorway made them both turn. Zeb stood there, his tall frame filling the entrance, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene before him. "This is a private conversation," Pemberton said dismissively. "If you'll excuse us—" "I won't," Zeb replied, stepping into the classroom. "Miss Rhodes, are you all right?" Madeline nodded, relief flooding through her at his presence. "I'm fine, Zeb. Mr. Pemberton was just leaving." Pemberton looked between them, his eyes narrowing. "I see. You found yourself a local protector. How resourceful of you." Zeb's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. "I suggest you watch your tone when speaking to the lady." "Lady," Pemberton scoffed. "Do you know who you're defending, Cowboy? Has she told you about Boston?" "About us." "Harold, stop," Madeline warned, but Pemberton ignored her. "This lady was quite happy to share my bed while I was a guest lecturer at her father's university. Quite enthusiastic, in fact. Did she mention that part when she was playing the innocent victim?" Zeb's hands clenched into fists, but Madeline stepped between the men before he could react. "That's enough, Harold. You've said what you came to say, and I've given you my answer. Now leave." Pemberton's face contorted with anger. "You're making a mistake, Madeline. This yokel can't give you the life I'm offering." "No," Madeline agreed calmly. "He's offering something much better, respect." For a moment, Pemberton seemed ready to argue further, but something in Zeb's stance must have warned him against it. He jammed his hat back on his head. "You'll regret this." "When you're struggling to feed that bastard child." He never finished the sentence. Zeb moved with surprising speed for a man his size, grabbing Pemberton by the lapels and forcing him back against the wall. "That's no way to speak to the mother of your child," Zeb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Apologize to Miss Rhodes, now." Fear flickered in Pemberton's eyes. I apologize for my crude language." Zeb released him with a slight shove. "Now get out of this town. If I see you anywhere near Miss Rhodes again, you won't walk away so easily." Pemberton straightened his jacket, his composure shattered. "You haven't heard the last of this," he blustered, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. Without another word, he stalked out of the classroom. As his footsteps receded, Madeline sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted. "I'm sorry you had to hear all that." Zeb knelt beside her chair. "Are you truly all right?" She nodded, then, to her horror, began to cry. All the stress of the past months, the shock of seeing Harold again, the relief of Zeb's intervention had overwhelmed her defenses at last. Zeb didn't try to stop her tears. He simply took her hand, holding it between both of his, a steady presence while the storm passed. When her sobs finally subsided, he offered a clean handkerchief. "That was him, wasn't it, the father?" Madeline nodded, wiping her eyes. "Harold Pemberton. He was a guest lecturer at my father's university, brilliant, charming, attentive. I was flattered by his interest." She let out a shaky breath. "I didn't know he was married until it was too late. When I told him about the baby, he suggested I handle it discreetly and never contact him again." Anger flashed across Zeb's features. "And now he shows up offering to make you his mistress. The man's despicable." "He is," Madeline agreed, surprising herself with the clarity of that conviction. For months, she had carried guilt and shame over her relationship with Harold. Now, facing him again, she saw him clearly for what he was: a selfish coward who had taken advantage of her youth and naivety. "What he said about me," she began hesitantly. "About us in Boston doesn't matter," Zeb interrupted firmly. "Whatever happened before, whoever you were with, that's your past, not who you are." He squeezed her hand gently. "The Madeline Rhodes I know is brave, principled, and stronger than anyone I've ever met." Fresh tears welled in Madeline's eyes at his words. "How do you always know exactly what to say?" A small smile touched Zeb's lips. "Just speaking the truth as I see it." They sat in silence for a moment, hands still joined. Outside, the sounds of children playing drifted through the open windows, a reminder of the world beyond this quiet moment of understanding. Finally, Madeline took a deep breath. "Zeb, about your proposal." He looked up, hope and apprehension mingling in his expression. "Yes. I've been thinking about it constantly, weighing everything what it would mean for me, for the baby, for you." She met his gaze directly. "Before I give you my answer, I need to be absolutely certain of one thing." "Anything," Zeb said without hesitation. "Why me?" "You could have any woman in this county, someone younger, without my complications. Why would you choose this life?" Zeb considered her question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because when I look at you, I see someone who makes me want to be better than I am. Someone who faces life's hardships with grace and courage. Someone I respect and admire more with each day I know her." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "And because when I imagine my future, I can't picture it without you in it." The simple honesty in his voice touched something deep within Madeline. This wasn't flattery or manipulation, this was Zeb speaking his truth as plainly as he knew how. "Then my answer is yes," she said quietly. "I will marry you, Zeb Yates." Joy transformed his face. "You mean it, truly?" Madeline nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. "Truly. But there's something you should know first." She took a deep breath. "I think I'm falling in love with you too. It's not just gratitude or practicality. When I imagine my future now, you're in it." Zeb's smile widened. "That's the best news I could hope for." He hesitated, then leaned forward, his question clear in his eyes. Madeline nodded slightly, and he closed the distance between them, kissing her with gentle reverence. It was a brief kiss, sweet and full of promise. When they parted, Madeline felt a certainty settle over her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. "When?" Zeb asked, still holding her hands. "When can you marry me?" Madeline laughed softly at his eagerness. "Soon, I think, before the baby comes. Next week." Zeb suggested, "I can have everything ready." "Next week," Madeline agreed, surprising herself with her own decisiveness. "But Zeb, people will talk. They'll count months and make assumptions." "Let them," Zeb said firmly. "What matters is us, you, me, and this little one." He gently placed a hand on her rounded abdomen. "The rest is just noise." As if in response to his touch, the baby kicked. Zeb's eyes widened in wonder. "Was that?" Madeline nodded, placing her hand over his. "Yes, I think someone's eager to meet you." They married the following Saturday in a simple ceremony at Twin Pines Ranch. Reverend Phillips officiated, his initial reluctance overcome by Zeb's standing in the community and the general softening of opinion toward Madeline once her engagement was announced. Mrs. Perkins helped Madeline prepare, lending her a blue silk dress that could be altered to accommodate her condition. "It was my wedding dress," the older woman explained. "Never had a daughter to pass it to. Would mean a lot to see it worn again." The ranch hands decorated the porch with wildflowers and ribbons. To Madeline's surprise, several families from town attended, including the Collins and the Simpsons, bringing dishes for the celebration afterward. Zeb waited for her on the porch, dressed in his best suit, his face alight with happiness as she walked toward him on Mr. Collins' arm. The lumberman had offered to give her away when Madeline mentioned her father's passing. "Never seen Yates look so nervous," Mr. Collins whispered to her as they approached. "Man faces down rustlers without blinking, but he's about to jump out of his skin waiting for you." The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife, Zeb's kiss was more confident than their first, a seal on the promises they'd exchanged. The small gathering applauded, and Madeline felt a surprising sense of belonging as they turned to face their guests as Mr. and Mrs. Yates. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with music from a fiddle player among the ranch hands, dancing on the packed earth of the yard, and more food than Madeline had seen in one place since leaving Boston. Through it all, Zeb remained at her side, his hand finding hers often, as if reassuring himself that this new reality was not a dream. As the last guests departed, Madeline found herself alone with her new husband on the porch of what was now her home. The summer stars spread across the Nevada sky in breathtaking profusion, the air still warm from the day's heat. "Happy?" Zeb asked, his arm around her shoulders. Madeline leaned against him, content in a way she hadn't thought possible 6 months ago. "Very. Though I'm still not sure I deserve all this." "Deserve?" Zeb considered the word. "I don't know that any of us get what we deserve in this life, good or bad, but I know I'm grateful for whatever twist of fate brought you to Verdi." Madeline turned in his embrace to face him. "I was thinking about that day in church when you stood up for me. Why did you do it? You didn't know me then." Zeb's expression grew thoughtful. "I knew what it felt like to be judged unfairly. When I was 16, a drought year, some cattle wandered onto our land from a neighboring spread. They were half dead from thirst, and my father let them drink from our creek, nurse them back to health. The owner accused us of stealing them, brought the sheriff out. People whispered, took sides." He shook his head at the memory. "Eventually the truth came out, but I never forgot how it felt, having people look at you like you're something wrong." Madeline laid her hand against his cheek. "So you saw someone else being judged and couldn't stay silent." "Something like that," Zeb agreed. "Though I have to admit it wasn't just principle. Something about you caught my attention from the first time I saw you in town. When Reverend Philip started in on you that day, it just woke something in me." "Lucky for me," Madeline said softly. Zeb turned his head to kiss her palm. "Lucky for both of us." Their first weeks of marriage passed in a gentle rhythm of discovery and adjustment. Zeb was considerate of Madeline's condition, patient as she learned the routines of ranch life, and quietly delighted by every aspect of domestic partnership. Madeline found herself falling more deeply in love with him each day, touched by his thoughtfulness and the steady affection he showed both her and the unborn child. The baby arrived on a scorching August night, after a labor that left Madeline exhausted but triumphant. Dr. Adams attended the birth, with Mrs. Perkins assisting. Zeb paced the porch throughout the ordeal, coming in only when the doctor called him to meet his son. "A fine boy," Dr. Adams announced, placing the swaddled infant in Zeb's arms. "Strong lungs, good color. You've got a healthy heir, Yates." Zeb stared down at the tiny face in wonder. "He's perfect," he whispered, moving to Madeline's bedside. "Look what you did, love." Madeline smiled tiredly, reaching to touch the baby's cheek. "He has your chin." It was a kind fiction. The baby resembled Harold Pemberton around the eyes and mouth, but Zeb's smile deepened as if it were true. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names but hadn't settled on one. Now, looking at her son in her husband's arms, Madeline knew. "Matthew," she said. "It means gift from God." "Matthew Yates," Zeb tested the name, nodding approval. "A good name for a rancher." As summer faded into autumn and autumn into winter, the small family settled into a contented routine. Zeb doted on Matthew, spending hours with the baby when ranch work permitted, telling him stories about the land that would one day be his. Madeline watched their bond grow with a full heart, grateful beyond words for the man who had chosen to be a father in every way that mattered. Word came in November that Harold Pemberton had died suddenly of a heart ailment in San Francisco. The news reached Verdi through Dr. Adams, who maintained correspondence with medical colleagues in the city. "Thought you should know," the doctor told Madeline when he stopped by the ranch to check on Matthew. "Given the circumstances, Madeline thanked him for the information but felt surprisingly little at the news. Harold had become a distant figure in her mind, overshadowed by the reality of her life with Zeb. That night, she mentioned it to her husband as they sat before the fire after putting Matthew to bed. "I keep thinking I should feel something: grief, anger, relief," she admitted. "But it's as if he belonged to another lifetime." Zeb considered this, stoking the fire thoughtfully. "Maybe that's as it should be. The past is past. We're here now with our son, building something that matters." "Our son," Madeline repeated softly. "You've never once treated him as anything else." "Because he isn't anything else," Zeb said simply. "From the moment I first held him, he was mine, Madeline. Not by blood, but by choice, the best choice I ever made, besides marrying his mother." Madeline moved to sit beside him on the hearth rug, leaning against his shoulder. "Sometimes I wonder what I did to deserve you, Zebulon Yates." Zeb chuckled, wrapping an arm around her. "I told you before, I don't think life works on what we deserve, but if it did—" He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I'd say we deserve each other, and that's more than enough." As the first winter of their marriage deepened, bringing snow to the high pastures and quiet evenings by the fire, Madeline found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this place. From the shame and fear she'd felt that Sunday in church to the profound contentment of her life now, it seemed almost miraculous. When spring arrived, bringing new calves to the ranch and Matthew's first attempts at crawling, Madeline received an unexpected letter from the school board. With the town growing and a new teacher proving less capable than hoped, they were inquiring whether Mrs. Yates might consider returning to teach the older children in the fall. "They want me back," she told Zeb that evening, still surprised by the offer. Zeb looked up from where he was building a wooden horse for Matthew. "Will you accept?" "I don't know," Madeline admitted. "I love teaching, but Matthew is still so young and there's plenty to do here at the ranch." Mrs. Perkins mentioned she might be interested in helping with Matthew if you wanted to work again, Zeb said. "She's been hinting about being bored in that empty boarding house since her last tenant left." Madeline's eyebrows rose. "You've discussed this with Mrs. Perkins?" Zeb shrugged, looking slightly sheepish. "She brought it up when she visited last week. I may have mentioned how your eyes light up when you talk about your former students. You wouldn't mind if I taught again?" "Mind?" Zeb set aside his carving tools. "Madeline, I married you knowing exactly who you are, a teacher born and bred. I'd never ask you to be less than that. If teaching makes you happy, then that's what you should do." Tears pricked at Madeline's eyes. "How did I ever find you?" "As I recall," Zeb said with a smile, "I found you in a church, holding your head high despite everything." "And said shame me too," Madeline finished softly. "The words that changed my life." "Changed both our lives," Zeb corrected, rising to take her in his arms. "For the better, I'd say." Madeline returned to teaching that fall with Mrs. Perkins, happily installed at the ranch as Matthew's caretaker during school hours. The arrangement worked better than anyone could have expected. The children welcomed her back enthusiastically, the parents respectful now that she was Mrs. Yates rather than Miss Rhodes, and Madeline found a renewed sense of purpose in her work. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and milestones. Matthew's first steps. His first words, "Papa," came before "Mama," much to Zeb's proud delight. The addition of new land to the ranch. Improvements to the house. Small happinesses and ordinary challenges met together. In the spring of 1879, when Matthew was nearly 3, Madeline discovered she was expecting again. Zeb's joy at the news was boundless. "Another little Yates," he said, spinning her around the kitchen until she laughingly begged him to stop before she grew dizzy. "Matthew will be a wonderful big brother." The second pregnancy proved easier than the first, perhaps because Madeline was surrounded by love and support rather than fear and judgment. She continued teaching until the end of the term, and when their daughter arrived in November, a robust girl, they named Elizabeth after Zeb's mother. The entire town celebrated with them. "Two beautiful children," Zeb murmured as they watched Matthew peering curiously at his new sister. "And the most beautiful wife a man could ask for." Madeline leaned into his embrace, overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they had built together. "All because you had the courage to stand up in church that day." "Best decision I ever made," Zeb said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Even if I was terrified doing it." Madeline looked up at him in surprise. "You were terrified. You seemed so confident." "On the outside, maybe," Zeb admitted with a chuckle. "Inside, I was shaking like a leaf. Didn't know what had gotten into me, challenging Reverend Phillips that way. Just knew I couldn't sit there and watch them shame you." "My hero," Madeline teased gently. "Nah," Zeb disagreed. "You would have managed without me. You're the strongest person I know, Madeline Yates." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but I'm grateful I didn't have to." As Elizabeth grew alongside her brother, the ranch prospered under Zeb's careful management. Madeline continued teaching, finding a balance between her profession and family life that brought her deep satisfaction. The whispers and judgment that had once haunted her in Verdi became a distant memory as the years passed. Matthew grew into a thoughtful boy with his mother's intelligence and his father's love of the land. Though he resembled Harold Pemberton in some of his features, his character was shaped entirely by Zeb's steady influence and Madeline's nurturing guidance. By the time he was 10, he was following Zeb around the ranch, eager to learn everything about cattle and horses. Elizabeth, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit, showed an early aptitude for learning that delighted Madeline. By 7, she was reading well above her age level and entertaining her family with stories of her own invention. "She gets that from you," Zeb often told Madeline, "that imagination, that love of words." "And her stubbornness?" Madeline would ask with a raised eyebrow. "Oh, that's all Yates," Zeb would admit with a laugh. "Poor child never stood a chance with the two of us as parents." In the summer of 1888, when Matthew was nearly 12 and Elizabeth 9, Zeb and Madeline celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary. The ranch hands organized a surprise party, with the entire community turning out to honor the couple who had become pillars of Verdi society. "Imagine, Mrs. Whitaker said to Madeline during the celebration, her voice mellowed with age and perhaps a touch of remorse. "How differently things might have turned out if Zeb hadn't spoken up that day." Madeline, now 42 and comfortable in her position as Mrs. Yates, regarded the older woman with a gentle smile. "Life has a way of working out as it should, Mrs. Whitaker. I've learned not to question the paths that brought me here." Later, as the music played and their friends danced under the stars, Zeb found Madeline watching Matthew teaching Elizabeth a new step. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Yates," he said, slipping an arm around her waist. Madeline leaned into his familiar embrace. "I was just thinking how fortunate we are, how full our lives have become. Regrets?" Zeb asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not one," Madeline replied firmly. "Every step, every challenge, they all led me here, to you, to our children, to this life we've built together." Zeb turned her to face him, his expression serious beneath the silver now threading his sandy hair. "When I stood up in that church 15 years ago, I had no idea what I was beginning. I just knew I couldn't let you stand alone." "And now?" Madeline asked, searching his face. A smile broke across Zeb's features, as warm and genuine as the day she'd first seen it. "Now I thank God every day for giving me the courage to speak, for bringing you into my life, for our family." He brushed a tender kiss across her lips. "For everything, Madeline, everything." As the music swelled around them, Zeb drew her into the dance, their movements as natural together as their life had become. Around them, their children laughed, their friends celebrated, and the future stretched ahead, a future built on a foundation of love that had begun with a simple act of courage in a small town church. And in that moment, surrounded by the life they had created together, Madeline knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the heart of the man who had stood beside her when she needed it most, and had never left her side since.